September 19, 1940. Warsaw, Poland. The city is a graveyard of buildings. The swastika flies over the royal castle. In the streets, the SS are conducting a łapanka, a massive random roundup of civilians. Trucks block the intersections. German soldiers scream at men to line up against the walls. Civilians are running, hiding in doorways, diving into cellars. Panic is everywhere. But in the middle of this chaos, one man is doing something that defies all human survival instincts. He is not running away. He is walking calmly towards the SS patrol. He is wearing a nondescript flat cap and a worn jacket. He waits until a German officer looks his way, and then he simply joins the line of prisoners. His name is Witold Pilecki, a 39-year-old cavalry officer and a father of two, and he has just sentenced himself to hell. To understand why a sane man would do this, we must look at the shadows of the Polish underground. By 1940, the resistance knew that the Nazis were building a massive new concentration camp in the south near the town of Auschwitz, a place the Germans renamed Auschwitz. But nobody knew what was happening inside. Was it a transit prison, a labor camp, or something worse? The rumors were terrifying but vague. The Polish commanders decided they needed an agent on the inside. They needed someone to infiltrate the camp, organize the prisoners, and prepare for an uprising. It was a suicide mission. There was no plan for extraction. When the commander asked for a volunteer, the room went silent. Only Pilecki stepped forward. He kissed his wife Maria and his two children goodbye, telling them he had work to do for the country. He carried false papers under the name Tomasz Serafiński. The trap worked perfectly. Pilecki was beaten with rifle butts, thrown into the back of a canvas-covered truck, and driven to a holding area. For 2 days, he and thousands of other men were kept in the dark, starved and thirsty. Then they were loaded onto cattle cars. The floors were covered in lime. There were no windows, only cracks in the wood through which they could see the Polish countryside flashing by. The men inside were terrified, praying, crying. Pilecki sat silently, observing, memorizing faces, already working. He was no longer a husband or a father. He was Agent 4859. The train stopped at night. The doors were thrown open, not to silence, but to a cacophony of screaming, barking dogs and blinding floodlights. "Raus! Raus! Schnell!" The prisoners were dragged out onto a concrete platform. They were blinded by the lights and deafened by the blows. SS guards with whips struck anyone who moved too slowly. Pilecki saw men being clubbed to death right there on the platform for simply stumbling. This was his first realization. This is not a prison. This is an extermination machine. They were marched towards a gate. Above it, wrought in iron letters, was the infamous lie, "Arbeit macht frei," work sets you free. As they passed under it, the world changed. The air smelled of burning flesh and sweet chemicals. They were stripped naked, their heads were shaved, and their civilian identities were erased. Pilecki was given a striped uniform and a number tag. He ceased to be Witold Pilecki. He was now number 4859. The induction was brutal. Ers Capo, a prisoner who worked for the Nazis, asked Pilecki what he did before the war. "I was an officer," Pilecki replied. The capo smashed him in the face with a wooden club, knocking out 2 of his teeth. "Here you are not an officer!" the capo screamed. "Here you are shit!" Pilecki spat out the blood and the teeth and stood up. He didn't show fear. He didn't show anger. He showed a cold, calculating resolve. He realized that to survive, he would have to become invisible. He would have to endure the unendurable. But as he looked around the barracks, seeing the emaciated faces of the inmates, he knew his mission was even more urgent than Warsaw imagined. He wasn't just there to report on a prison, he was there to witness the end of the world. Winter 1940. Auschwitz was not yet the industrial factory of death it would become later. It was a chaotic concentration camp designed to break the Polish intelligentsia through brutal labor and starvation. For Witold Pilecki, prisoner 4859, surviving the daily beatings was only the first layer of his existence. His real work began after the roll calls, in the freezing darkness of the barracks, or during the brief stolen moments in the latrines. He had to build an army. But how do you build an army when your soldiers are starving, their heads are shaved, and any whisper can be heard by an informer? Pilecki knew that a standard military hierarchy would be suicide. If the Gestapo caught one commander, they would torture him until he gave up the whole platoon. So Pilecki invented a structure of genius paranoia, the system of fives. The concept was mathematical and ruthless. Pilecki would recruit 5 men. These 5 men would know only him and each other. They would not know anyone else in the organization. Each of these 5 men would then be ordered to recruit their own 5. The new recruits would not know Pilecki existed. They would only know their immediate recruiter. This meant that if a man was dragged to the death wall of Block 11 and tortured, he could only betray the 4 men in his specific cell. The rest of the pyramid, the hundreds of other conspirators, would remain safe, cut off by layers of intentional ignorance. It was a firewall made of human silence. Recruiting was a dance with death. Pilecki had to observe a potential candidate for weeks. He watched how they handled hunger. Did they steal bread from a weaker prisoner? If so, they were useless. Did they share their last crust? They were potential. Did they keep their head up when the SS walked by? They were officers. Pilecki would approach a man while carrying stones in the quarry or huddled around a stove. He wouldn't ask, "Do you want to join the resistance?" He would whisper a phrase about Poland, about honor, testing the reaction. One wrong judgment, one recruitment of a Volksdeutscher, an ethnic German collaborator, or a broken man looking for extra soup, and Pilecki would be hanging from the gallows within the hour. Yet, miraculously, his intuition was flawless. He recruited Colonel Władysław Surmaki and Dr. Władysław Dering, turning the camp hospital into a secret headquarters. The organization he created was called ZOW, Związek Organizacji Wojskowej, Union of Military Organization. Its mission was threefold, and each objective was nearly impossible. First, morale. The camp was designed to turn men into animals. ZOW's job was to remind them they were still soldiers. They organized secret prayer groups, history lectures whispered in the dark, and distributed extra food stolen from the SS kitchens to the weakest members. They saved men from becoming Muselmänner, the camp term for the walking dead, prisoners who had given up on life and were just waiting to collapse. Second, intelligence. Pilecki needed to know everything. He tasked men who worked in the administration office to memorize the arrival numbers. He had men in the crematorium counting the bodies. He had men in the construction details stealing maps of the expanding camp. Third, defense. This was the most dangerous. They prepared for an uprising. They stole rusted tools to sharpen into shivs. They mapped out the guard towers. They identified which capos were the most sadistic, and in dark corners, ZOW execution squads began to quietly assassinate the worst collaborators, making their deaths look like accidents or typhus cases. But the enemy was evolving. The SS began to expand the camp. They started building something new at a site nearby called Birkenau. Pilecki's network began to report disturbing changes. It was no longer just Polish political prisoners arriving. It was Soviet POWs, and then increasingly Jews from all over Europe. The violence shifted from brutal discipline to industrial slaughter. The ZOW members working in the infirmary reported that the SS doctors were injecting phenol directly into the hearts of patients to clear the beds. Pilecki realized that the outside world had absolutely no idea this was happening. Warsaw thought Auschwitz was a prison. Pilecki knew it was becoming a black hole. The pressure on Pilecki was crushing. He was suffering from pneumonia. He was lice-ridden. He was starving on a diet of watery turnip soup. Yet, he had to be the rock for 1,000 men. He slept only a few hours a night, his mind constantly rotating through the names, the codes, the logistics of his invisible army. He saw the blue police, the Polish police working for Germans, and the SS guards laughing while men died in the mud. He wrote in his mind the reports he needed to send. He realized that building the army wasn't enough. He had to scream. He had to get the data out. And so the volunteer moved to the next phase of his plan. He didn't just need soldiers, he needed a radio. In a place where possessing a pencil was a capital offense, Pilecki decided to build a radio transmitter from smuggled spare parts found in the German workshops. It was a task that required the precision of a watchmaker and the nerves of a bomb disposal expert. If the SS found the transmitter, they wouldn't just kill Pilecki, they would likely massacre the entire block. But the silence of the world was louder than the fear of death. By 1942, Witold Pilecki had achieved the impossible. He had built a functioning military resistance cell inside the most tightly controlled prison on Earth. But the ZOW was an army without a voice. The atrocities Pilecki was witnessing were escalating beyond human comprehension. The SS were no longer just killing individuals, they were experimenting with mass murder. Pilecki realized that if he didn't warn the Allies immediately, there would be no one left to save. He ordered his men to do something that was technically a death sentence, just to attempt, build a radio transmitter. The logistics of this operation were a masterpiece of subterfuge. Pilecki's men infiltrated the DOW, Deutsche Ausrüstungswerke, German equipment works, the camp's industrial sector where prisoners repaired radios and electronics for the Wehrmacht. Over the course of 7 months, piece by piece, they stole the components. A vacuum tube hidden in a hollowed-out potato, a coil of copper wire wrapped around a man's leg under his trousers, a capacitor swallowed and retrieved later. They smuggled these parts into Block 28, the camp hospital, which was the safest place because the SS feared typhus and rarely conducted thorough searches there. In a tiny hidden crawl space beneath the floorboards of the infectious disease ward, they assembled the device. It was a Frankenstein machine, crude but functional. They had to steal electricity by splicing into the camp's main power line, a task that, if done incorrectly, would have blown the fuses for the entire sector and alerted the Gestapo instantly. On a Sunday afternoon, while the SS were distracted by a camp orchestra concert, Pilecki's radioman turned it on. The hum of the tubes warming up was the sound of freedom. They tapped out the first Morse code signal to the Polish Home Army receiver in Warsaw. 4859 calling. We are here. We are alive. But the radio was only one channel. It was dangerous to use for long periods because the Germans had triangulation trucks driving around the perimeter. For the detailed reports, the data, the maps, the names, Pilecki relied on human couriers. He organized escape attempts not just for freedom, but for data delivery. When a prisoner managed to escape, often aided by ZOW distractions, they carried tiny strips of microfilm hidden in hollow keys in the heels of their boots or sewn into the seams of their clothes. These were the Pilecki reports. The content of these reports was a descent into madness. Pilecki was the first intelligence agent in the world to document the transition of Auschwitz from a concentration camp to a death camp. He reported on the construction of the new facility at Birkenau, Auschwitz II. He described the arrival of the first transports of Jews who were not registered as prisoners but were marched directly to bathhouses that pumped out black smoke. He reported the first tests of Zyklon B gas on 600 Soviet POWs and 250 Poles in the basement of Block 11. He wrote with the cold precision of a military analyst, detailing the dimensions of the crematoria and the daily processing capacity of the ovens. In his transmissions, Pilecki made a request that shocked the commanders in Warsaw and London. He didn't ask for food. He didn't ask for medicine. He begged the Allies to bomb the camp. "Drop everything on us," he signaled. "A swift death from a British bomb is a mercy compared to what is happening here." He argued that destroying the gas chambers and the railway lines was worth the collateral damage of killing the prisoners. The ZOW was ready to launch a suicidal uprising on the ground the moment the first bombs fell, attacking the watchtowers while the SS were distracted. They were ready to die fighting rather than die in the gas. Then came the silence. The reports reached Warsaw. They were forwarded to the Polish government in exile in London. They were passed to British and American intelligence. And nothing happened. The Allied command couldn't process the information. The scale of the horror described by Pilecki was so vast, so industrial, that the analysts dismissed it as Polish exaggeration or war propaganda. Gas chambers? Impossible. No nation would do that, was the prevailing skepticism. They couldn't believe that a civilized German nation was running a factory for human biological destruction. For Pilecki, this silence was more painful than the torture. He was risking his life every second to gather this intelligence. He was watching thousands of men, women and children disappear into the chimneys of Birkenau every day, assuming that the moment the world knew, the paratroopers would arrive. But as the months dragged on into years, the realization set in: no one is coming. The sky remained empty of Allied bombers. The trains kept arriving. The ovens kept burning. Pilecki realized that the civilized world had either abandoned them or was too incompetent to understand the urgency. By the spring of 1943, the noose was tightening around Witold Pilecki's neck. The Gestapo had begun to suspect a high-level conspiracy within the camp. Key members of the ZOW were being rounded up, tortured, and shipped off to other camps to break the network. Pilecki, now operating under the constant shadow of the gallows, realized his time was running out. He had spent 947 days in hell. He had built an army, sent reports and begged for intervention, but the silence from the outside world persisted. He made a cold calculation. He could stay and eventually be executed as a martyr, or he could break out and personally grab the commanders of the Polish Home Army by the collar to force an attack on Auschwitz. He chose the impossible. He chose to leave. The opportunity presented itself in the form of bread. The camp bakery was located outside the main electric perimeter wire, about 2 kilometers from the central barracks. It was still heavily guarded, surrounded by soldiers and dogs, but it lacked the high-voltage fatality of the inner fence. Pilecki used his influence within the camp administration, influence bought with years of bribery and blackmail, to get himself and 2 trusted ZOW lieutenants, Jan Redzaj and Edward Ciesielski, assigned to the night shift at the bakery. The date was set for Easter Monday, April 26, 1943. Pilecki reasoned that the German guards, even the SS, would be slightly more relaxed, perhaps even drunk, on the holiday night. The preparation was a masterclass in scavenging. They needed civilian clothes to blend in once they escaped. They managed to steal German work dungarees that looked ambiguous enough to pass for civilian workmen's clothes in the dark. They stole tobacco soaked in heavy alcohol and pepper, a mixture designed to be scattered behind them to burn the noses of the tracking dogs. But the most critical tool was a rusted iron hook they had fashioned to unlatch the heavy bakery door from the inside. If the hook didn't work, or if the bolts were rusted shut, they would be trapped inside with the SS guards when the morning shift arrived. The shift began at sunset. The heat in the bakery was suffocating. The air smelled of yeast and desperation. Pilecki and his men worked the ovens, sweating profusely, their eyes darting to the single SS guard watching them. As the night wore on, the guard grew bored. He sat down near the entrance, his Mauser rifle resting on his knees, and began to doze off, lulled by the heat and the rhythmic clanging of the metal trays. This was the window, but it was a window of seconds. If the guard woke up while they were at the door, they would be shot point blank. At exactly 2 a.m., Pilecki gave the signal. Under the cover of the noise of a fresh batch of bread being pulled from the iron ovens, Redzaj moved to the back door. He inserted the homemade hook. The bolt groaned. The sound seemed deafening to them, like a gunshot in a library. The SS guard stirred, shifted his weight, grunted, and went back to sleep. Redzaj pushed. The heavy wooden door creaked open, revealing the cool, wet night air of occupied Poland. It was the smell of freedom. But they weren't free yet. As they slipped out into the darkness, a sensor alarm, a simple bell rigged to the door, tripped. Clang, clang, clang. The silence of the night shattered. The SS guard inside woke up instantly, shouting, "Halt! Halt!" and fumbling for his rifle. Pilecki, Redzaj, and Ciesielski didn't look back. They sprinted. They ran with the desperate energy of men who had been caged for 2.5 years. The first shots cracked behind them. Pop, 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 bullets whistling past their ears, tearing into the bark of the trees. They ran towards the Soa River, tearing off their camp numbers and scattering the tobacco pepper mixture in their wake. They could hear the shouts of alarm echoing from the guard towers and the terrifying barking of the Alsatians being released from the kennels. They plunged into the icy water of the river to break their scent trail, wading through the mud, slipping, gasping for air, their hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds. They emerged on the other bank, wet and freezing, and vanished into the dense forest. For the first time in 947 days, Witold Pilecki looked up at the stars and didn't see them through barbed wire. But the escape was only the beginning of a new nightmare. There were 3 emaciated men, heads shaved, wearing ill-fitting clothes, deep in Nazi territory with a massive manhunt spreading out in every direction. They had to cross 100 kilometers of hostile terrain to reach the safety of the resistance units. During the day, they hid under piles of leaves and branches, lying motionless as German patrols walked within meters of them. At night, they moved like ghosts, navigating by the stars Pilecki had memorized. In one terrifying encounter, they were spotted by a group of German colonists, civilians settled on Polish land. The civilians raised the alarm, and the fugitives were fired upon again. A bullet grazed Pilecki's shoulder, tearing through his coat, but miraculously missing the bone. They scrambled into a dense thicket, holding their breath while the pursuers argued about which way they had gone. They survived on river water and raw sorrel leaves. After days of evasion, they finally made contact with a local farmer who was part of the underground. When Pilecki walked into the farmhouse and said, "I am from Auschwitz," the farmer looked at him as if he was seeing a ghost. No one escaped Auschwitz. It was a place you went to die, not a place you left. Pilecki sat down at the farmer's table, drank a glass of warm milk, and felt the tears running down his face. He had done it. He had broken out of the Devil's Fortress. But there was no time to rest. He had a report to write, a report that he believed would finally bring the fire from the sky to destroy the factory of death he had left behind. August 1943, Witold Pilecki was back in Warsaw. To the casual observer, he looked like just another war-weary Pole trying to survive the occupation, but inside he was a man haunting the living. He walked the streets of the capital seeing ghosts. When he saw a tram full of people, he didn't see commuters. He saw a cattle car heading to Birkenau. When he saw smoke rising from a chimney, he didn't think of a warm hearth. He smelled burning flesh. He was suffering from a profound, alienating dislocation. He had returned from the underworld to the land of the living, only to find that the living did not understand the language of hell. He immediately went to work on his magnum opus, Witold's report. This was not a brief summary. It was a dense forensic document, over 100 pages long, typing out the exact methodology of genocide. He detailed the specific chemical used in the gas chambers, Zyklon B, the daily caloric intake of the prisoners, barely enough to sustain life for 3 months, and the sadistic medical experiments. But beyond the statistics, he tried to convey the soul of the camp. He wrote about the erosion of morality, how hunger turned men into beasts, and how the SS had created a system where the victims were forced to become accomplices in their own destruction. He poured his trauma onto the paper, believing that once the commanders read this, the order to attack would be given within hours. The meeting with the High Command of the Home Army, Armia Krajowa, was the moment Pilecki had lived for. He stood before the generals, gaunt but intense, and laid out his plan. It was bold. The ZOW inside the camp had thousands of members ready to strike. Pilecki proposed that the Home Army launch a coordinated ground assault on the camp's perimeter from the outside, while simultaneously Allied bombers would drop paratroopers or precision bombs on the SS barracks and the fence lines. In the chaos, the prisoners would storm the towers, break the wire, and a mass escape of tens of thousands would overwhelm the Germans. The response was a silence that froze Pilecki's heart. The commanders looked at the maps, they looked at the report, and then they shook their heads. "It is impossible, Witold," they told him. Their logic was cold and military. The Home Army didn't have the heavy weapons to breach the concrete fortifications of Auschwitz. An attack would likely fail to liberate the camp, but would almost certainly provoke the SS to massacre every single prisoner inside as an act of revenge. Furthermore, the Allies, the British and Americans, had refused to bomb the railway lines. They claimed their bombers were needed for strategic industrial targets in Germany, not for humanitarian missions that offered no tactical advantage to the war effort. Pilecki argued ferociously. He screamed that this wasn't about strategy, it was about humanity. He told them that every day they waited, another 5,000 people were being gassed. He told them about the Hungarian transports, the children, the mountains of shoes. But the commanders were unmoved. They viewed Auschwitz as a tragedy, yes, but a peripheral one. The main objective was the liberation of Poland, not a single camp. They told him to rest, to recover, to forget about the impossible attack. This rejection broke something in Pilecki that the torture in Auschwitz couldn't touch. He felt a profound sense of betrayal, not just by his commanders but by the civilized world. He realized that the moral war against Hitler was a lie. The Allies knew. The report was on Churchill's desk. It was in Washington. They knew about the ovens, and they were choosing to do nothing. The conspiracy of silence was real. Pilecki felt like a man screaming behind a glass wall. He had sacrificed 3 years of his life, lost his teeth, ruined his health, and watched his friends die, all to bring out a truth that nobody wanted to act upon. But Pilecki was a soldier, and a soldier does not stop fighting just because the battle is lost. If he couldn't save the prisoners of Auschwitz, he would fight the Germans where he stood. He hid his report in a safe place, swallowed his bitterness, and rejoined the underground fight in Warsaw. The city was boiling with tension. The Soviet Red Army was approaching from the east, and the Polish resistance decided to launch one final desperate gamble to liberate their own capital before the Soviets arrived. They called it Operation Tempest. The world knows it as the Warsaw Uprising. Pilecki, technically an officer who should have been in command, hid his rank. He didn't want to lead from the back. He wanted to fight on the front lines. He joined a combat unit simply as Captain Roman. He didn't tell the young soldiers next to him that he was the man who had volunteered for Auschwitz. He picked up a submachine gun, adjusted his helmet, and prepared to enter a new circle of hell. Warsaw was about to burn, and Pilecki would be in the center of the fire, fighting not for victory anymore but for honor. August 1st, 1944, Hour W. At exactly 5:09 p.m., the streets of Warsaw exploded. From windows, cellars, and manholes, 50,000 soldiers of the Polish Home Army rose up against the Nazi occupation. They were armed with little more than rusty pistols, homemade grenades, Filipinkas, and Molotov cocktails. Against them stood the full might of the German Wehrmacht, panzer divisions, Tiger tanks, and Stuka dive bombers. Witold Pilecki, now fighting under the pseudonym Captain Roman, found himself in the center of this cauldron. He had been assigned to the Crowbury II Battalion, a unit tasked with holding a critical sector of the city center. Pilecki initially tried to fight as a simple private, hiding his rank to avoid special treatment, but his natural authority was impossible to mask. When the initial commander fell, the young soldiers, many of them teenagers wearing stolen German helmets and oversized armbands, turned to the quiet, older man with the sad eyes. Captain Roman took command. He turned a block of apartment buildings and the headquarters of a railway company into a fortress known as the Great Bastion. For the next 63 days, this square of concrete would become one of the most heavily contested pieces of land in World War II. The fighting was medieval in its ferocity. The Germans, infuriated by the rebellion, unleashed the Dirlewanger Brigade, a unit composed of convicted criminals, rapists, and murderers released from prisons specifically to terrorize Warsaw. They didn't just fight. They butchered civilians, burned hospitals with patients inside, and used women as human shields in front of their tanks. Pilecki witnessed horrors that rivaled Auschwitz, but here he had a weapon in his hand. He organized his defense with the same meticulous precision he used to build the radio in the camp. He set up crossfires, sniper nests, and anti-tank barricades made of overturned trams and rubble. The Germans threw everything at Pilecki's bastion. They used Goliaths, miniature remote-controlled tanks packed with explosives, to drive into the Polish barricades and detonate. They used Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, the screaming cows, that leveled entire city blocks in seconds. Yet the bastion held. Pilecki moved among his men like a ghost, calm and reassuring. When a tank shell hit their building, shaking the dust from the ceiling, he would simply dust off his uniform and check the ammunition supply. He became a father figure to the young insurgents, teaching them how to conserve bullets and, more importantly, how to not lose their humanity amidst the slaughter. But the real tragedy of Warsaw was happening across the Vistula River. The Soviet Red Army, which had been advancing rapidly across Poland, suddenly stopped. They set up camp on the east bank of the river, just a few hundred meters away. Through his binoculars, Pilecki could see the Soviet tanks idling. He could see the smoke of their campfires. The Polish resistance radioed frantically to the Soviets. "We are fighting the Germans. Help us. Cross the river." But Stalin ordered his army to wait. He wanted the Nazis to kill the Polish resistance. He wanted the flower of the Polish nation, the patriots, the intellectuals, the brave, to be exterminated, so that when he finally took the city, there would be no one left to oppose a communist takeover. It was a slow-motion execution. For 2 months, Pilecki watched the sky, hoping for Soviet air support or American supply drops. The Americans tried, flying dangerous missions from Italy, but most of the canisters drifted into German lines because the Soviets refused to let the planes land on their airfields to refuel. The city was starving. They ate dogs, cats, and finally boiled shoe leather. The water supply was cut. The sewers became the only way to move between districts, dark, sludge-filled arteries, where soldiers waded chest-deep in filth, carrying the wounded, while the Germans dropped grenades down the manholes. By October 2, 1944, it was over. Warsaw was not captured. It was obliterated. 200,000 civilians were dead. The city was 85% destroyed. The Home Army had no choice but to capitulate. Pilecki, ever the soldier, refused to escape into the ruins. He insisted on surrendering with his men to ensure they were treated as prisoners of war according to the Geneva Convention, rather than executed as bandits. As he marched out of the rubble of the great bastion, head held high, he looked back at the city he loved. It was a sea of broken bricks and ash. The Germans would spend the next 3 months systematically dynamiting whatever buildings were still standing. Pilecki was sent to a German POW camp, Oflag 7A Murnau. Compared to Auschwitz, it was a holiday camp. He had food, he had a bed, and he wasn't beaten. But he spent the rest of the war in a state of deep, brooding anxiety. He knew that the defeat of Germany was inevitable now, but he also knew that for Poland, the end of World War II would not be a liberation. It would simply be a change of jailers. The Nazis were leaving, but the Soviets were coming. And Witold Pilecki, the man who knew too much, the man who believed in a free Poland, was about to face an enemy even more dangerous than the Gestapo, his own liberators. May 1945. The war in Europe ended. The swastika was torn down, and the world celebrated. But for Witold Pilecki, liberated from the German POW camp in Murnau by the Americans, there was no victory parade. While his fellow officers were drinking champagne with US soldiers and planning new lives in London or Paris, Pilecki sat in silence, looking east. He knew the truth. Poland had not been freed. It had been occupied. The Iron Curtain was descending, and Warsaw was now ruled by a puppet communist government installed by Moscow. The NKVD, Soviet secret police, and the UB, Polish Ministry of Public Security, were hunting down the heroes of the Home Army, branding them capitalist spies and enemies of the people. General Władysław Anders, commander of the Polish II Corps in Italy, gave Pilecki a choice. "Stay in the West," he said. "You have done enough. You have a wife and children in Poland. But if you go back, you will die." Pilecki didn't hesitate. "I cannot live my life while my country is a prison," he replied. "Someone must tell the world what the Soviets are doing." Once again, the volunteer accepted a suicide mission. He packed his bags and slipped back into Poland, not as a soldier this time, but as a civilian spy. He arrived in Warsaw in late 1945. The city was a phantom. The ruins were covered in snow. The people were grey, fearful, whispering in queues for bread. Pilecki reconnected with what remained of his old network. He found that the terror was different now. Under the Nazis, the enemy was visible, uniformed men speaking German. Under the communists, the enemy spoke Polish. They were your neighbors, your colleagues, the people you fought beside in the uprising. The UB had turned the country into a panopticon of surveillance. Pilecki began to compile a new dossier, the Rapport Brzoza. He documented the falsified referendum of 1946, the arrests of high school students for writing patriotic graffiti, the torture cellars in the Ministry of Security, and the deportations of former Home Army soldiers to Siberian gulags. He also discovered something that chilled him to the bone. The communists were using the old Nazi concentration camps. Auschwitz, Majdanek, and others were being reopened to hold anti-state elements. The machinery of oppression hadn't been dismantled. It had just been repainted red. By 1946, his cover was fraying. The UB was closing in. They knew there was a high-level mole sending reports to the West. General Anders sent an urgent courier from Italy with a direct order. "Get out now, we can extract you, the net is closing." Pilecki read the order. He thought of his wife, Maria, and his 2 children, Zofia and Andrei, whom he had barely seen in 6 years. He missed them with a physical ache, but he also thought of the thousands of young men rotting in the UB jails, waiting for someone to speak for them. He sent a message back, "I cannot leave, I have no replacement, I will stay until the end." The end came on May 8, 1947. Pilecki was visiting the apartment of a contact in Warsaw. He didn't know that the contact had been turned by the UB under torture. As he walked out into the stairwell, the shadows moved. Strong hands grabbed him. He didn't fight. He knew the game was up. He was shoved into a black sedan and driven to the ominous Mokotów prison on Rakowiecka Street, a place known as the Slaughterhouse. The interrogation that followed made Auschwitz look like a child's play, as Pilecki himself would later whisper to his wife. The interrogators were not interested in truth. They wanted a show trial. They wanted him to confess that he was a paid spy for imperialist powers, that he was planning to assassinate communist leaders, that he was a traitor to the Polish people. Pilecki refused. They tore out his fingernails. They broke his ribs. They crushed his testicles. They kept him in a cell with the light on 24 hours a day. Yet he never gave up a single name of his fellow conspirators. He protected his network to the last breath. During his show trial in March 1948, the public saw a broken man. Pilecki shuffled into the courtroom, his face grey, his body bent. But his eyes were clear. When the judge, a man who had never fired a shot for Poland, read out the charges of high treason, Pilecki interrupted him. "I have tried to live my life so that in the hour of my death I would feel joy, not fear," he said. It was a statement of supreme moral victory. He knew the verdict was written before the trial began. Guilty, death penalty. The gavel came down. Pilecki didn't flinch. He looked at his wife in the gallery, smiling faintly, trying to comfort her with his gaze. He was taken back to the death cell. He had survived the Gestapo, the typhus, the starvation, the SS, and the Warsaw uprising. But he would not survive his own countrymen. May 25, 1948. 9:30 p.m. The basement of Mokotów prison in Warsaw. It was a place designed to strip a man of his dignity before taking his life. Witold Pilecki was led down the concrete stairs by 2 guards. He was dressed in rags, his body broken by months of torture, but his head was high. He wasn't led to a wall in a courtyard for a soldier's death by firing squad. The communists denied him that final honor. Instead, they dragged him into a small, soundproofed boiler room. The executioner, Staff Sergeant Piotr Śmietański, known as the Butcher of Mokotów, was waiting. He held a pistol. Pilecki whispered his last words, "Long live free Poland." There was no blindfold. Śmietański stepped behind him and fired a single shot into the base of his skull. The body of the man who had outsmarted the SS, who had built an army inside Auschwitz, and who had held off tanks in Warsaw crumpled to the wet concrete floor. He was 47 years old, but the regime wasn't satisfied with killing him. They wanted to delete him. They took his body under the cover of darkness to the Powązki military cemetery, to a section known as the Meadow, Łączka. There were no gravestones there, only a garbage dump. They threw Pilecki's body into a nameless pit, covered it with trash and quicklime to speed up decomposition, and buried him alongside other enemies of the state. No family was notified. No priest was present. They wanted Witold Pilecki to simply cease to exist, to become a phantom that never was. For the next 40 years, the communist government of Poland enforced a terrifying silence. Mentioning the name Witold Pilecki was a crime. In history books, the Warsaw Uprising was distorted, and the resistance at Auschwitz was attributed solely to communist cells. His wife, Maria, and his children lived in poverty, stigmatized as the family of a traitor. They couldn't get good jobs. They were watched by the secret police. Every All Saints' Day, Maria would go to the cemetery and light a candle on an empty patch of grass, hoping against hope that her husband lay somewhere beneath the earth, even if she didn't know where. But history has a way of escaping its chains. In 1989, the Iron Curtain fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. As the archives of the secret police were thrown open, the people of Poland began to discover the monsters in their past, and the saints. Historians found the dusty files on Agent 4859. They found the Pilecki report, ignored for half a century. When the report was finally published in Poland in the 1990s, it caused a national shockwave. People read the words of a man who described the indescribable with the clarity of a prophet. They realized that the greatest hero of the war wasn't a general or a politician, it was the volunteer. In a final poetic twist of justice, the site of the Meadow was excavated in 2012 by forensic archaeologists. They found the remains of hundreds of executed heroes, their hands still tied behind their backs with wire. While Pilecki's specific remains have not yet been conclusively identified by DNA, a heartbreaking ongoing search, the site has been transformed from a garbage dump into the Pantheon, mausoleum of the cursed soldiers. Today, Witold Pilecki is no longer a traitor. He is the patron saint of intelligence officers, a symbol of European resistance, and arguably the bravest man of the 20th century. His face is on stamps, coins, and murals across Poland. The chief rabbi of Poland has called him a holy man. The British historian Michael Foot named him one of the 6 bravest resistance fighters of the war. But his legacy is deeper than medals. Witold Pilecki teaches us the terrifying cost of moral clarity. He shows us that in a world of absolute evil, survival is not the highest goal. Integrity is. He walked into hell not because he had to, but because he couldn't live with himself if he didn't. He proved that you can strip a man of his name, his rank, his teeth, and his life, but you cannot take his free will. The story ends not in the basement of Mokotów, but in the sky. Imagine the spirit of Pilecki finally released from the burden of his duty. He is no longer prisoner 4859. He is no longer Captain Roman. He is simply Witold, reunited with the men of his ZOW army, watching over a free Warsaw, knowing that the truth, no matter how deep you bury it, eventually grows through the concrete. I have tried to live my life, so that in the hour of my death I would feel joy, not fear. Mission accomplished, volunteer.